My name is Kaylee Thompson, and I was exactly 34 years old, standing on the shivering threshold of a life I no longer recognized, when my sister looked me in the eye and told me to find somewhere else to die. It was a bitter Tuesday in Hartford, Connecticut, just 3 days after our parents' funeral. The air still tasted of damp earth and expensive lilies, yet while I was still clinging to a polished mahogany cane, the only thing keeping me upright since the shattering car accident that nearly claimed my soul 2 years ago, Blair stood in the doorway of the only sanctuary I had left. She said those words with a surgical precision, without a single tear marring her perfectly applied Chanel foundation. She hadn't come alone. She had brought stacks of cardboard moving boxes that smelled of industrial adhesive and clinical finality. She had brought her husband, Julian Thorne, who stood behind her like a well-dressed shadow in a charcoal suit. And she had brought a calculated cruelty I never knew lived inside the girl I grew up with. Our parents had just been buried at Cedar Hill Cemetery. The heavy scent of the funeral wreaths hadn't even wilted yet, the petals barely beginning to brown at the edges. And my sister, my own blood, was orchestrating my eviction from the house where I'd spent the last 2 years reclaiming my dignity, healing, and caring for the very people she barely deigned to visit between her charity galas and social obligations. She thought I had nothing. She thought I was a broken relic of a woman, useless and discarded by fate. She thought wrong. Before I tell you the shattering truth of what transpired at the lawyer's office 72 hours later, please take a moment to support this narrative by liking and subscribing, but only if you truly find value in this journey. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Perhaps the sun is setting on your world just as it was on mine. To understand why those words cut deeper than any surgical blade, I need to take you back to the day everything fractured. 2 years before my parents died, I was a rising landscape architect with my own boutique firm based right here in Hartford. I didn't just plant flowers, I sculpted the earth. I designed sprawling English gardens for wealthy clients in West Hartford, restored historic Federalist estates, and had just secured a prestigious contract with the city's Botanical Society to redesign the Rose Circle. Life was vibrant. Life made perfect geometric sense. Then, on a rain-slicked Friday night, a drunk driver ran a red light at 40 miles per hour. I don't remember the screech of tires or the visceral impact of metal meeting bone. I only remember waking up in a sterile hospital wing with titanium rods fused to my spine and a team of surgeons explaining in hushed, clinical tones that I might never walk again. The surgery lasted 11 grueling hours. The recovery, they warned, would take years of agonizing patience. My modern apartment was a death trap of stairs I could no longer climb. My design office had half-finished blueprints I could no longer manage. My savings had finite limits that six-figure medical bills refused to respect. So when my parents offered their guest room on the first floor, a sun-drenched space overlooking the backyard, I swallowed my pride and said yes. I moved back into the colonial house where I grew up, back into the bedroom that still held my high school track trophies on the dusty oak shelves, taunting reminders of a grace I had lost. For 18 months, I was tethered to a wheelchair. I learned to navigate the frustrating geometry of door frames and the slippery danger of bathroom tiles, enduring the particular searing humiliation of needing help with the most intimate tasks I'd handled alone since I was a toddler. My mother read Wharton and Dickinson to me on the days when the nerve pain felt like electricity. My father spent his weekends building a sturdy cedar ramp for the back porch, just so I could sit in the garden and feel the New England sun on my face. Blair called once a month, sometimes less, her voice brimming with an impatient pity. She never asked about the grinding repetition of my physical therapy. She never asked how I was managing the phantom pains or the crushing weight of my lost career. The few times she did call, if I was the one to pick up the handset, her response was always a chilly, clipped refrain. "Oh, you're still there. Put Mom on." Still there? As if I were a stubborn wine stain on a white rug that refused to wash out despite her best efforts. What Blair didn't know, what she never bothered to investigate through her veil of indifference, was that 4 months before our parents' lives were extinguished, I had started walking again. It began with a walker, then progressed to a sturdy cane. I was knitting myself back together. I was getting stronger, rebuilding my core and my resolve. But in her narrow, elitist worldview, I would always be the useless one, the broken sister who was an anchor on the family's upward mobility. The Christmas before our parents died, Blair arrived like a conquering queen with her manufactured family in tow. Julian wore a cashmere overcoat that cost more than 3 months of my specialized spinal injections. Their 2 children, Seraphina and Archer, ran through the halls with a sense of entitlement, treating our ancestral home like a disposable Airbnb. Blair directed everyone like a high-stakes stage manager, rearranging the heirloom furniture, critiquing my mother's Vera Wang table settings, and reminding us all, with a condescending smirk, how things should be done in a proper household. I spent 3 days meticulously preparing her children's favorite meals to ease the burden on my mother. I made artisanal mac and cheese for Archer and gourmet chocolate chip pancakes for Seraphina. I did it all while bracing myself against the granite counter, my cane propped against the wolf range, my lower back screaming in protest after only 20 minutes because I ached to contribute. I wanted to be more than a ghost in my own home. On Christmas morning, everyone gathered in the formal living room for the obligatory family portrait. My father set up the Nikon on a tripod. My mother nervously adjusted the hand-blown glass ornaments on the 12-foot fur. The kids wrestled over who got to sit on the velvet ottoman. Blair looked at me and smiled, but it was a thin, brittle expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Kaylee, honey, maybe you should sit this one out in the kitchen. We want a flawless photo for the Christmas card we're sending to the Thorne family associates," she added, her voice sweetened with venom. The room went deathly quiet. My mother opened her mouth to protest, then faltered under Blair's icy glare. My father stared at the camera lens as if he were suddenly deaf to the cruelty. "It's just," Blair shrugged, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light. "The clunky cane and the orthopedic posture don't really fit the aesthetic, you know? It ruins the symmetry of the family unit." I wasn't even in the wheelchair anymore. I was standing, trembling but upright, on my own 2 feet. But I didn't argue. I had learned through years of psychological warfare that arguing with Blair only provided her with the ammunition she craved. So I forced a smile, gave a stiff nod, and retreated into the kitchen. Through the paned glass window, I watched my family pose in a tableau of perfection without me. I heard the shutter click once, twice, 3 times, capturing a lie for the world to see. I didn't know then that my father had witnessed the entire exchange through the reflection in the camera lens, and I certainly didn't know what decisive action he took the very next morning at his club. Our parents died on a gray, unforgiving Tuesday in March. They were flying to Napa, California for an old Yale classmate's golden wedding anniversary. It was a private Gulfstream charter, 6 passengers, and the pilot had reported clear blue skies. The plane went down somewhere over the desolate Sierra Nevada mountains. The investigators later cited catastrophic mechanical failure in the tail section. They said it was instantaneous. I was in the back garden when the call came, meticulously pruning the heirloom roses my mother had planted 15 years ago to celebrate my graduation. The phone rang inside the house, and 30 seconds later, the entire foundation of my world disintegrated. Blair flew in for the funeral, instantly assuming the role of the grieving, capable matriarch. She handled everything with chilling efficiency. The floral arrangements from the top florist in Manhattan, the catering from a Michelin-starred chef, and a guest list that read like a who's who of New England. I was too emotionally hollow to fight her. I sat in the front pew at the service, my hand white-knuckled on my cane, and realized with a jolt of horror that I didn't recognize half the people in attendance. They were Blair's business contacts, Julian's investment partners, people who had never shared a meal with my parents but wanted to be seen paying respects to the Thompson fortune. 3 days after we lowered them into the frozen ground, Blair demanded we speak privately. She cornered me in the living room, surrounded by stacks of sympathy cards and ivory envelopes that I couldn't bring myself to touch. She didn't sit. She stood in the archway with her arms crossed over her designer mourning weeds, Julian hovering behind her like a predatory shadow. "I've spoken with the estate lawyer," she said, her voice devoid of any sisterly warmth. "The ruling is final. Everything. This house, the offshore accounts, the entire Thompson estate passes directly to me." I looked up, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What lawyer, Blair? Who did you see?" "The family lawyer," she snapped, waving her hand as if brushing away a bothersome fly. "Dad's estate attorney. He confirmed the lineage of succession. I'm the eldest. It's standard procedure." "Did he give you official documentation? A copy of the notarized will?" Blair's left eye twitched, just for a millisecond. "I don't need to show you a damn thing, Kaylee. You have exactly 2 weeks to pack your pathetic life and find somewhere else to live." A chilling sensation, like an icy draft from the Connecticut River, settled deep in my gut. Blair had referred to him only as the lawyer. Not a name, not a prestigious firm, just a vague, faceless title that lacked the weight of truth. My parents had relied on Thatcher Sterling for over 20 years, a man whose lineage in Hartford law was as old as the stone foundations of our house. If Blair had actually sat across a polished mahogany desk from him, she would have used his name like a social weapon. She was bluffing, playing a high-stakes game of psychological chicken with a sister she assumed was too broken to fight back. That night, I sat alone in my father's darkened study, the air heavy with the scent of old leather-bound books and his favorite pipe tobacco. I took a brutal, cold-eyed inventory of my life. No job. I had been forced to shutter my firm 18 months ago when the predatory medical bills made it impossible to keep the lights on in my studio. No savings. What little I had accumulated in my years of success had been swallowed by insurance copays, high-priced spinal specialists, and the endless parade of prescriptions that were the only thing keeping my spine from seizing into a knot of agony. No income. Social Security disability payments barely covered the basics of a modest existence. And now, apparently, no home. I looked around the room, the golden glow of the desk lamp catching the dust motes dancing in the air. I saw my father's executive desk, the oak surface worn smooth by 40 years of labor and legacy. I saw my mother's velvet reading chair, the fabric faded to a soft sage where she always rested her head while humming along to jazz records. The window looked out over the dormant winter garden we had built together, her planting the seeds, me designing the topography, both of us dreaming of the blooms that would survive the frost. This house wasn't just 4 walls and a roof insulated against the New England winters. This was where I took my first uncertain steps on the hardwood, where I learned to ride a shin bike in the gravel driveway, where my mother taught me to braise a pot roast and my father taught me how to construct a logical argument. Every room held a haunting memory. Every corner held a fragment of my parents' souls. If I walked away now, I wouldn't just be losing a piece of real estate. I would be losing them all over again, erasing their fingerprints from my life. And worse, I would be validating Blair's twisted narrative. I would be accepting that I was nothing more than a liability, that I didn't deserve to breathe the same air as the successful, that I was worth nothing. I couldn't accept that. I wouldn't. With a sudden surge of adrenaline that masked my physical pain, I started opening drawers, rifling through the organized chaos of my father's professional life. I was looking for something, anything, a clue that Blair's house of cards was built on lies. In the bottom drawer of his heavy oak desk, beneath old tax returns and faded Polaroids of our summer trips to Martha's Vineyard, I found a crisp, cream-colored business card. Thatcher Sterling, Esquire, Estate and Trust Law. I turned it over in my trembling fingers. On the back, in my father's precise, architect-like handwriting, were 6 words that felt like a lifeline thrown into a dark sea. Call him. He knows everything. My father never wrote cryptic notes. Never. He was a man of blueprints and directness. So why this one? 3 days later, just as the morning mist was lifting off the lawn, Blair came back. I was in the living room, determinedly practicing my gait without the mahogany cane. The physical therapist had said I was ready to test my limits. I wanted to prove, if only to the empty air, that I could do something on my own. The front door wasn't just opened, it was slammed against the wall, a violent intrusion. Blair walked in carrying stacks of flat-packed cardboard boxes, Julian trailing behind her with more, looking like a man who had lost his soul to a spreadsheet. She dropped them at my feet, the hollow thud echoing through the high ceilings like a gavel. "Pack your things," she said, her voice shorn of any pretense of empathy. "You have until Friday to vacate the premises." "Blair, I need more time. I'm still what? Clinging to your victimhood? Still pretending to be permanently sidelined?" "I was in a near-fatal car accident, Blair. You know the trauma my body has endured." 2 years ago, she violently kicked one of the boxes toward me with her designer loafer. "You've milked that tragedy for long enough, Kaylee. The free ride is over." Julian shifted uncomfortably, loosening the tie that seemed to be choking him. "Honey, Maybe we should keep this civil. Stay out of the family drama. Julian, be quiet! Behind me, I heard Clara, the private nurse who had cared for my parents in their final months, come in from the kitchen. She stopped in the doorway, her eyes widening with a mix of shock and professional disdain. Beside her stood Mrs. Gable, our neighbor of 40 years, who had come over to drop off a homemade chicken pot pie. They both heard the venom that came next. Blair stepped closer, encroaching on my personal space until I could smell her expensive, metallic perfume. She looked at me the way you look at discarded trash on a pristine sidewalk. "Find somewhere else to die, Kaylee," she hissed. "You're an evolutionary dead end. You're useless now." The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Clara made a small, sharp sound of protest. Mrs. Gable's hand went to her chest, clutching her pearls in genuine horror. Blair didn't even deign to acknowledge their presence. To her, they were invisible, part of the service class, utterly unimportant. But I saw Clara do something calculated. She pulled a small moleskin notebook from her pocket and scribbled something down with a fierce intensity, like she was documenting a clinical malpractice. At the time, I didn't understand the gravity of that gesture. Later, I would. Mrs. Gable was the first to move. She stepped forward, her 70-year-old frame suddenly rigid with the kind of New England steel that only decades of unshakable friendship can forge. She had known my mother since before I was born. She had held me as a colicky infant. She had watched both Thompson girls grow up, and she had clearly drawn a line in the sand. "Blair Eileen Thompson." Mrs. Gable's voice could have shattered a crystal decanter. "Your mother would roll in her grave at Cedar Hill if she heard you right now." Blair turned slowly, her face instantly smoothing into a mask of polite, condescending confusion. "I'm sorry. Who exactly authorized you to enter this private family conversation?" "I've known this family for 40 years, longer than you've been alive, and making demands, young lady." "This is private family business, Mrs. Gable." "I was family before you knew how to manipulate people to get your way." Mrs. Gable moved to stand beside me, her warm hand finding my arm and squeezing with a strength that surprised me. "Eleanor loved both her daughters, but she wasn't blind to the rot, Blair. None of us were." Something primal flickered across Blair's face. Uncertainty, maybe, or just white-hot annoyance at being checked by someone she considered a non-player. Julian stepped forward, reaching for his wife's elbow with a shaking hand. "Vic, Blair, come on. We can resolve this at the club." "Don't touch me." She pulled away, her voice ascending to a shrill, hysterical pitch. "My mother left me in charge, not her, not some meddling neighbor who thinks she has a seat at the table." "Your mother didn't leave you in charge of anything but your own ego, Blair." Mrs. Gable's words were quiet, final. Not yet. The room went stiflingly still. Blair's jaw tightened, the muscles jumping in her cheek. She looked at me, then at Mrs. Gable, then at Clara, who was still standing in the kitchen doorway with her notebook like a silent witness to a crime. "Fine." Blair grabbed Julian's arm and pulled him toward the door with predatory force. "Friday, Kaylee. I want you and your pathetic cane out of my house by Friday." The door slammed behind them, shaking the framed photos on the entryway table. Mrs. Gable squeezed my arm. "Don't you shed a single tear, honey. This game isn't over by a long shot." The next morning, the Hartford fog clung to the ground like a cold, damp shroud. Julian Thorne came back alone. I found him standing on the expansive wraparound porch, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a tailored wool coat, looking like a man who had just spent the night staring at the ruins of his own reflection in a glass of neat bourbon. When I opened the heavy oak door, the hinges groaning in the morning chill, he actually flinched. "Blair doesn't know I'm here," he said quickly, his breath hitching in the frost. "Can we talk, Kaylee? Just for a moment?" I hesitated, then stepped aside, letting him into the foyer where the silence of my parents' absence felt heavier than ever. We sat in the formal living room, the scene of Blair's recent tantrum. He perched on the very edge of my mother's antique wingback chair, while I settled onto the couch, my mahogany cane propped against the armrest like a silent sentry. He wouldn't, or couldn't, meet my eyes. "Look," he started, his voice thin and strained. "About yesterday." Blair's under a staggering amount of pressure. "Pressure to render her disabled sister homeless 3 days after burying our parents?" I asked, my voice devoid of heat, just cold, hard fact. He winced, as if I'd slapped him with a legal brief. "It's not personal, Kaylee. We desperately need the liquidity from the estate." I went very still, the gears of my architect's mind beginning to grind. Need the money? This property alone is worth $4 million on the current market, Julian, not to mention the offshore portfolios. He stopped, catching himself, his face turning a mottled shade of red. I mean, the estate should be liquidated quickly for the benefit of the entire family unit. Julian. I leaned forward, the nerve pain in my spine a dull hum. What's really going on? What are you hiding behind those French cuffs? He was quiet for a long, agonizing moment, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the sound of a man at the end of his rope, he confessed. "We're in catastrophic trouble, Kaylee. The private equity investments I leveraged last year, they didn't just fail, they evaporated. We owe a debt that would sink a small bank, more than we can possibly cover through our current cash flow." "How much, Julian?" He looked at the hand-plastered ceiling, then at the Persian rug, searching for an exit that didn't exist. $400,000, give or take. The creditors are circling like great whites, Kaylee. The bank is threatening a foreclosure on our Greenwich estate. Serafina and Archer's tuition at the academy is months overdue. Blair is trying to maintain the optics, to hold the Thorne name together, but Julian! Blair's voice, sharp as the shards of broken Waterford crystal, cut through the room from the doorway. We both jumped. I hadn't even heard her Range Rover pull up the gravel drive. "What are you doing here? Humiliating yourself in front of her?" She marched over and grabbed his arm, her knuckles white, her eyes blazing with the desperate fury of a cornered socialite. "Let's go. Now." Julian mouthed a word at me as she dragged him toward the door. It might have been sorry. It might have been help. In that moment, he looked less like a Wall Street powerhouse and more like a scared passenger on a sinking ship. I know what some of you might be thinking right now, watching this play out like a New England noir. Why didn't you strike back then, Kaylee? Why didn't you call the authorities or scream the truth from the rooftops? I asked myself the same question as I watched their luxury SUV speed away. But here's what years of meticulously designing landscapes has taught me. Sometimes, the most powerful move isn't a reaction. It's the quiet observation of a structural flaw. If you've ever been in a situation where someone grossly underestimated your resolve because of your physical state, type "I know" in the comments. And if you're curious what shattering revelations awaited in Thatcher Sterling's office 72 hours later, keep watching. Now, back to the unfolding wreckage. That evening, the shadows in the study grew long and predatory. I found the business card again. Thatcher Sterling, estate attorney. The handwriting on the back, "Call him, he knows everything," seemed to vibrate under the warm glow of the desk lamp. I dialed the number before I could talk myself into another night of victimhood. The phone rang twice, then a voice deep, measured, and resonating with the authority of 30 years in the Hartford Bar Association answered. "Sterling and Associates." "Mr. Sterling, this is Kaylee Thompson, Robert and Eleanor's youngest." There was a pause, a brief silence where the air seemed to thin. Then his tone shifted to something decidedly warmer. "Ms. Thompson, I've been expecting your call with a great deal of anticipation." Something in his cadence made me grip the receiver until my palms sweat. "You have? Your father was quite certain you would reach out when the time was right. He was unusually confident about your timing, actually." I heard the distinct rustle of heavy legal bond paper in the background. "I understand your sister has been making some rather expansive claims regarding the distribution of the Thompson estate. She's under the impression that the entire legacy passes to her by default. She even claimed you confirmed this in person." A dry, cynical laugh echoed through the line. "I haven't had the pleasure of speaking with Blair since your parents' 30th anniversary gala 3 years ago. She certainly hasn't stepped foot in my firm, nor has she requested a formal briefing on the probate status." The relief that flooded through me was so visceral, it was almost dizzying. A physical weight lifting off my scarred spine. "So, she's lying. The whole thing is a fabrication." "I wouldn't presume to characterize your sister's psychological state, Miss Thompson. What I can tell you is that your parents were extremely specific, meticulous even, about their final wishes." He paused, a calculated silence that told me he was holding the winning hand. "Very specific, Miss Thompson. There are clauses in this document that would make a seasoned litigator blush." "What does that mean, Thatcher?" "It means I would like you to arrive at my office for a private consultation before the official reading of the will. There are contingencies and aspects of this estate plan that require a great deal of context." Another pause, longer this time, heavy with the gravity of what was to come. "Things that no one else in the Thompson lineage knows, least of all your sister." I wrote down the appointment time, 10 a.m. Friday, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Miss Thompson?" His voice softened, losing its professional edge. "Your father demanded a total revision of his will exactly 6 months ago, immediately following the Christmas holiday. He told me he finally saw the architecture of his family with perfect, painful clarity. The Christmas photo. The one I was erased from to preserve Blair's aesthetic. He had been watching from the shadows of the kitchen doorway, after all. He hadn't just seen a camera flash. He had seen the soul of his eldest daughter, and he hadn't liked the view. The day before the high-stakes reading at Sterling and Associates, Clara, the nurse, came to say her final goodbye. She stood on the stone porch with a heavy navy cardigan wrapped tight around her shoulders, looking smaller, more fragile than I remembered. For 8 months, she had been a constant in this house, monitoring vitals, managing the delicate chemistry of my parents' medications, sitting with my mother through the long, dark New England nights when the bone pain kept her from sleep. Now her watch was ended. She was moving on to another family, another hospice case, another quiet ending. "I wanted to give you something, Kaylee," she said, her voice rough with emotion. She reached into her medical bag and pulled out a leather-bound journal, the edges worn soft by years of touch. I recognized it instantaneously. My mother's elegant, looping cursive covered the visible page, the way she always pressed the nib of her fountain pen so hard it nearly bled through the paper. "Your mother entrusted this to me for safekeeping," Clara said, pressing the notebook into my hands with a solemnity that chilled me. "She said you'd need the truth someday. She said you'd know exactly when the seal needed to be broken." I traced my mother's initials, E.T., embossed in fading gold on the cover. "What's in here, Clara?" Her unfiltered thoughts, her final observations of the storm that was coming. Clara hesitated, her eyes scanning the quiet street for Blair's SUV. "The final entries, they're about you and the woman your sister has become. I didn't read them out of respect, but I think your mother wanted you to have the final word." Blair orchestrated the memorial reception with the same cold, tactical precision she applied to a corporate takeover. It was held at Max Downtown, the kind of high-ceilinged, white tablecloth institution in Hartford where the city's power brokers strike deals over dry martinis. She had rented out the private gallery room, arranged for a menu of pan-seared scallops and aged prime rib, and sent invitations on heavy, cream-colored cardstock with my parents' names embossed in gold foil. She hadn't asked me about the vintage of the wine. She hadn't asked me about the floral arrangements of white hydrangeas and calla lilies. She hadn't asked me anything at all. I arrived late. My taxi had gotten caught in the bottleneck traffic near Bushnell Park, and navigating the polished marble floors of the restaurant with my mahogany cane took a physical toll I hadn't calculated. By the time I reached the heavy glass doors of the private dining room, Blair was already positioned at the head of the long banquet-style table, a glass of expensive Napa Cabernet raised in her manicured hand. She was giving a speech. 40 people sat before her, a sea of faces draped in designer black. There were great-aunts from Greenwich I barely recognized, and business associates of my father who looked like they were checking their watches for their next flight to London. There were Julian's investment partners, members of Blair's country club committee, and a crowd of social climbers who had never shared a quiet Sunday brunch with my parents, but were eager to be seen paying respects to the Thompson estate. "My parents worked their whole lives to build this institution of a family," Blair was saying, her voice carrying that particular practiced cadence of a woman who expected and demanded admiration. "And I promise to steward that legacy with the respect it deserves. This house, our standing in this community, everything they engineered, I will protect it." She said this family like it was a trademarked brand, a deed of ownership she was recording in real time. I stood in the doorway, breathless and leaning heavily on my cane, and not a single person in that crowded room acknowledged my existence. "Mom and Dad would be so gratified by the stability we've maintained," Blair continued, her eyes scanning the room like a CEO addressing shareholders. The Thompson name will endure. I'll make sure of it. I gripped the cold wood of my cane until my knuckles went white. She hadn't mentioned me once. Not once. It was as if I had already been systematically erased from the family narrative she was so determined to rewrite. Someone in the crowd finally noticed me hovering at the edge of the light. A murmur rippled through the room, a shifting of silk and the clink of silverware. Blair's speech faltered for just a millisecond, a glitch in her perfect programming, before she recovered with a sharp, practiced smile. Kaylee, you finally made it. We were beginning to think the commute from the guest wing was too much for you. The way she said it, as if my presence was a mildly inconvenient afterthought, a ghost at the feast, made my skin crawl. I made my way toward an empty seat near the back, my cane tapping a rhythmic, hollow beat against the dark wood floors in the sudden silence. Blair! It was Dorothy Thompson, my father's older sister, speaking with the bluntness of someone who had seen through Thompson dramas for 70 years. What about Kaylee? What are the logistics for her living arrangements now? The question hung in the air like a looming storm cloud. 40 pairs of eyes shifted between us. Blair's smile didn't waver, but it hardened into something brittle. Kaylee has her own plans. She's transitioning. Transitioning to where exactly? Dorothy pressed, her voice cutting through the polite veneer. Blair shrugged delicately, the light catching her diamond earrings. Wherever she can manage her recovery. She's always been remarkably resourceful. A few people chuckled, small, nervous laughs, the kind of sounds people make when they want to look sophisticated while witnessing a tragedy. But they laughed. I stood there, feeling the weight of every pitying gaze and every judgmental whisper. Most people just looked away, uncomfortable with my physical vulnerability, eager to return to their wine and the safety of small talk. Blair glided past me on her way to greet a state senator near the bar. As she passed, she leaned in close, her perfume smelling like a cold autumn morning. I told you to stay in your room, Kaylee, she whispered. You're a walking embarrassment to the family image. I didn't respond. I remembered what Thatcher Sterling had told me during our private briefing that morning. Let her talk. The more oxygen she takes up now, the louder the silence will be when the gavel falls. So, I found my seat. I folded my hands in my lap, watched the ice melt in my water glass, and I waited. Blair had no idea the foundations of her world were already hollowed out. Mrs. Gable arrived 20 minutes later, wearing a sharp black suit and a look that could have curdled the cream in the coffee service. She scanned the room until she found me alone at my corner table, pushing a salad around my plate without eating. Then her gaze shifted to Blair, who was holding court near the bar, laughing at something Julian had whispered into her ear. Mrs. Gable's jaw tightened, a visible sign of New England fury. She walked straight toward the head of the table. Is it true, Blair? She asked, her voice projecting to the back of the gallery room. What Dorothy just told me. Did you really tell this room that Kaylee is transitioning out of her own home? I nodded almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Gable didn't wait for a response. Before I could stop her, she raised her voice loud enough to silence the entire restaurant. Eleanor and Robert would be sickened if they could see this display of vanity. The room went absolutely stagnant. Blair turned, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. "Excuse me? This is a private memorial, Mrs. Gable." "You heard me." Mrs. Gable didn't flinch. "This girl," she pointed at me with a trembling but certain finger, "took care of your parents every single hour of every single day while you were too busy building your image in Greenwich. She bathed them. She managed their pain. She held your mother's hand when the darkness closed in." Mrs. Gable's voice cracked with a raw, righteous anger, but she didn't stop. "What did you do, Blair? You sent seasonal flowers and a standardized card." Someone in the back gasped. Julian stepped forward, reaching for Blair's arm as if to stabilize a collapsing building, but she shook him off with a snarl. "You have no right to intrude on this family matter." "I have every right. I was Eleanor's confidant for 40 years. Mrs. Gable moved to stand beside me, her hand a warm, solid weight on my shoulder. "And I know exactly what kind of disposable daughter you've been." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of sound. A fork clinked against a plate like a gunshot. Blair's face had gone from a flush of red to a deathly, chalky white. For the first time, I saw the facade crumble, something uncertain and panicked flickering in her eyes. Mrs. Gable leaned down and whispered in my ear, "I spoke to Thatcher this morning. Just hold your head up, Kaylee. The reckoning is coming." 3 days later, I walked into Thatcher Sterling's office on the 12th floor of the Hartford Financial Building. The receptionist directed me to a boardroom at the end of the hall, a space of dark mahogany, deep-seated leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the skyline of the city. The kind of room where the trajectory of lives is permanently altered. Blair was already there. She sat at the head of the massive conference table like she was presiding over a board meeting, her Hermès Birkin bag positioned as a centerpiece, her posture rigid and perfect. Julian sat beside her, scrolling through his phone with the frantic, twitchy energy of a man whose debts were about to become public knowledge. I took a seat across from them, my cane leaning against the chair like a discarded weapon. Blair didn't even deign to look in my direction. Thatcher Sterling entered with a leather briefcase and a court reporter trailing behind him like a shadow. He was older than I remembered, silver-haired, distinguished, with the heavy, unhurried calm of a man who had delivered life-altering news to the highest echelons of Connecticut society. "Thank you all for being present," he said, settling into his high-backed chair. "Before we proceed to the formal reading, I need to verify the chain of documentation." He opened a heavy manila folder and looked directly at Blair. "Mrs. Thorne, have you ever been presented with the complete, final will your parents filed with this office?" Blair straightened her Chanel jacket. "I've seen the will, Thatcher. It was in my mother's bedside nightstand. We've already discussed this." "The document in the nightstand?" Thatcher nodded slowly, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Can you describe its contents for the record?" 4 pages, standard inheritance language, everything left to me as the eldest and primary trustee. Thatcher removed his tortoiseshell glasses and cleaned them with a slow, theatrical deliberation. The gesture was excruciatingly unhurried. "Mrs. Thorne," he said quietly, "have you ever seen the executed last will and testament, or merely the summary for reference your mother kept for her own peace of mind?" Blair's hand tightened on the strap of her bag until her knuckles turned blue. For the first time, the mask of the perfect daughter vanished completely. "What are you talking about? That was the will. I have the copies." Thatcher opened his briefcase and withdrew a massive document bound in blue legal backing, thick enough to thud when he placed it on the table between us. "This is your parents' actual last will and testament. 32 pages, executed exactly 6 months ago in this very room, witnessed by my senior partners, notarized, and filed with the probate court." Blair leaned forward, her voice hitting a jagged, hysterical note. "That's impossible. I saw the document. It was dated 5 years ago. It said—" "What you saw, Blair, was a preliminary draft. Your parents kept it as a sentimental reference, but they updated their entire estate plan significantly following the Christmas holiday." Thatcher tapped the heavy blue folder. "This is the only legal reality that exists. Everything else is just paper." Julian's phone clattered to the table. He didn't bother to pick it up. "This is fraud!" Blair stood, her designer chair scraping violently against the hard wood. "You're conspiring with her! She probably forged—" "Mrs. Thorne." Thatcher's voice didn't rise, but it hardened into a blade of pure granite. "I have been this family's legal counsel for 22 years. I drafted your parents' first trust when you were still in prep school. I do not commit fraud, and I find your implication to be as offensive as it is legally illiterate." Blair opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her hands were shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. "Sit down," Thatcher said. It wasn't a request. She sat. I watched my sister's face cycle through a kaleidoscope of emotions. Disbelief, feral anger, and then, finally, the cold realization of total defeat. When she finally looked at me, there was something new in her eyes. Panic. Pure, unadulterated panic. "They wouldn't do this to me," she whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice. "They wouldn't." Thatcher began turning the heavy, crisp pages. "Perhaps we should let your parents speak for themselves from the record." The room felt stiflingly small, the air growing thin, and I realized with a sharp jolt of adrenaline that the world I knew was about to be burned to the ground. Thatcher Sterling adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses, the fluorescent lights of the 12th floor boardroom reflecting off the heavy crystal water carafes. He read slowly, with a deliberate cadence that felt like the steady tolling of a bell in a New England cathedral, giving weight to every syllable. "To our daughter, Blair Louise Thompson Thorne, we leave our entire primary investment portfolio, managed through Sterling & Associates, and valued at approximately $14 million. Blair made a sharp, triumphant sound, a half-gasp, half-laugh of pure greed. She looked at me with a vicious, predatory glint in her eyes, as if she had already mentally spent every cent on the liquidation of my existence. Julian leaned forward, his chest heaving with the visible relief of a man who had just seen the gallows dismantled. $14 million, he whispered, the color finally returning to his hollowed cheeks. But Thatcher didn't stop. He turned the page, the crisp paper sounding like a gunshot in the silence. "However," he continued, his voice dropping into a register of cold, clinical finality, "this portfolio is to be held in a strictly managed, irrevocable trust. Blair may withdraw a maximum of $50,000 per year for living expenses, with the remainder of the principal and accrued interest to be distributed solely to her children, Serafina and Archer, upon their respective 30th birthdays. Blair made a sound like she'd been physically struck, a visceral grunt of agony. A trust? Julian's voice erupted into a frantic, high-pitched stammer. What do you mean, a managed trust? Thatcher, we have immediate capital requirements. We need that liquidity today. Thatcher continued as if Julian were nothing more than a minor static interference on a long-distance line. The document includes a formal letter of intent from your parents explaining their strategic reasoning. Shall I read it? Yes, I said, before Blair could choke out an objection. Thatcher cleared his throat. We love Blair with all our hearts, but we have watched her struggle with catastrophic financial impulsivity throughout her adult life. We have seen vast sums of Thompson capital disappear into lifestyle ventures and Julian's speculative failures that never materialized. We do not wish for our life's work to be liquidated within a fiscal year of our passing. The trust is not a punishment. It is a structural safeguard against her own narcissism. Blair's face had gone from the flush of victory to a sickly ashen gray. Julian was staring at the polished mahogany table as if he wanted it to open up and swallow his debts whole. Now Thatcher turned several pages, reaching the section regarding the family estate, the $4 million colonial crown jewel of Hartford. I stopped breathing. We leave our ancestral home and the surrounding 3-acre property to our daughter, Kaylee Ann Thompson. Thatcher looked at me over his glasses, a faint supportive glint in his eyes. With the strict legal condition that it may not be sold, leveraged, or collateralized for a period of 10 years. Kaylee has been our unwavering comfort and sole companion through our final, most difficult years. She has tended our gardens, managed our vulnerabilities, and given us a peace that money cannot buy. The house belongs to her. She is the only one who has earned the right to walk its halls. My vision blurred, the tears finally breaking through the wall of shock. Somewhere far away, in the distant background of my consciousness, Blair was screaming, objecting, demanding a stay of execution. But I couldn't hear her over the thunderous heartbeat in my own ears. All I could hear were my parents' voices reaching out from beyond the grave to build a fortress around me. There is one more thing, Thatcher said, his voice cutting through Blair's hysterical protests. He reached into his leather briefcase and withdrew a gold-plated USB drive. Your parents recorded a multimedia message to be played specifically at this reading. They were quite insistent that the visual record be preserved. Blair's head snapped up, her hair disheveled, the mask of the Greenwich socialite completely shattered. What video? I was their power of attorney. I never authorized any recordings. That was precisely the point, Mrs. Thorne. Thatcher connected the drive to a sleek laptop, and a moment later, my mother's face appeared on the massive 60-inch monitor mounted on the boardroom wall. She was sitting in our living room, in her favorite sage velvet chair by the window. My father stood behind her, his hand a steady anchor on her shoulder. They both looked exhausted, but they looked remarkably determined. Girls, my mother began, her voice sounding like home. If you're watching this, it means we're gone, and it means the internal rot of this family has unfolded exactly the way we feared it might. My father spoke next, his voice resonating with a disappointment that felt heavier than any legal ruling. Blair, you're our firstborn. We've loved you since the moment you arrived, but love does not require us to be complicit in your cruelty. We've watched how you treat your sister. We've seen the way you dismiss her, diminish her, and treat her recovery like a social inconvenience. My mother's eyes glistened with a raw, maternal pain. Kaylee, you are not useless. You never were. You are the structural integrity of this family. While Blair chased the hollow glitter of status, you stayed in the trenches. You cared. You showed up. We changed our will the day after that Christmas dinner. My father's voice cracked with a sudden, sharp anger. After we watched Blair systematically exclude you from the family photo, after we heard her tell your mother that your wheelchair and your cane were dragging down the brand, we knew. We weren't going to let our death become another tool for you to be erased, Kaylee. My mother reached toward the camera, as if trying to touch my face through the pixels. We hope you two can reconcile, but reconciliation requires the truth. At the very least, Kaylee will never be in exile in her own home. The screen went dark, leaving only the reflection of the Hartford skyline in the black glass. I couldn't see through my tears, but I heard the violent scrape of Blair's chair as she stood and walked out of the room without a single word, her heels clicking like a countdown on the hardwood. If you've ever had someone in your family finally acknowledge your worth after years of being treated like a ghost, you know the shattering, beautiful weight of that moment. Type "finally" in the comments if this scene hit the core of your soul. And for those wondering what Blair did when the creditors finally caught up to her, the story isn't over. The real architecture of my new life was just beginning. Blair, didn't get far. I found her in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway outside the boardroom, leaning against the cold glass wall with her arms wrapped around herself as if she were trying to hold her crumbling life together. Julian stood a few feet away, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in frantic, hushed tones to someone, a bank manager, a creditor, or the sharks who were circling their lives. When Blair saw me, the last of her composure evaporated. "This isn't fair, Kaylee." Her voice was raw, stripped of its Manhattan polish. "You don't understand. I have a standard of living to maintain. I have social obligations. You have a sister you told to find somewhere else to die, Blair." She flinched as if the words were a physical blow. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did. You meant it with every ounce of your designer soul." I kept my voice as steady as a blueprint. "You've meant it for years. You think I don't know why you're so desperate?" She was sobbing now, her expensive mascara streaking down her cheeks like oil spills. "Julian's leverage collapsed. We owe $400,000 in immediate arrears. The bank is going to seize the Greenwich house. My children are going to be social pariahs. And you?" She pointed at me with a trembling, accusatory finger. "You don't even have a life. You don't need the capital." I let her words dissipate into the cold air of the hallway. "You're right," I said quietly. "I don't have the hollow life you've built. I don't have a husband who trades on my father's name. But I also didn't spend decades treating my own blood like an embarrassment. I took a step closer, not even leaning on my cane for that one moment of pure strength. You told me to find somewhere else to die. I found somewhere. I paused, letting the silence ring. It's called home. Blair's breath caught in a ragged sob. I'm not going to gloat, Blair. That's not the Thompson way. But I am going to establish a permanent boundary. I met her eyes, forcing her to see the woman she tried to erase. You will never speak to me or about me with that condescending venom again. Ever. Not in private, not in public, and especially not in front of your children. I am officially finished being your emotional dumping ground. She stared at me like she was witnessing a resurrection. I have a proposal, I continued, the architect in me taking control of the chaos. The trust gives you $50,000 a year. That's more than most people in the city earn in a lifetime. But I know it won't stop the foreclosure. I took a breath, the New England air feeling crisp and clean. I am willing to loan you the $400,000 to satisfy the bank. No interest, professional terms, enough to keep the kids in their school. Blair's mouth opened, a flicker of hope appearing in her devastated eyes. But there is one non-negotiable condition. I held up my hand. You will apologize, publicly and unequivocally, at a family dinner in front of every single person who was at that memorial at Mac's downtown. You will tell them exactly what you said to me, and you will tell them you were wrong. The hallway was deafeningly silent. Julian had stopped his call, staring at me as if I were a stranger from another world. Blair wiped her eyes, her vanity struggling with her desperation. And if I don't? Then you navigate the bankruptcy courts alone. Your choice. Blair didn't answer. She gathered what shreds remained of her dignity, picked up her bag, and walked toward the elevator. Julian followed her without a single backward glance. 1 month later, I moved into my parents' master suite. It felt surreal at first, waking up to the same view of the rose garden that my mother had cherished for 30 years. But it also felt profoundly right, as if the house itself were exhaling a long-held breath. I continued my physical therapy 3 times a week at the Hartford Clinic. Most days now, the mahogany cane stays in the umbrella stand by the door. I am walking on my own terms, designing my own future. The social geography of Hartford has shifted. The people who laughed at the memorial, the ones who called me resourceful with a sneer, now cross the street to avoid my gaze when I'm in West Hartford. Word has spread about the video, the trust, and the true nature of Blair's exit. They are mortified. Good. Blair and Julian sold their extravagant Greenwich estate for a fraction of its value. After settling their mounting debts, they had barely enough for a security deposit on a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a suburban town 40 miles away. Julian was quietly terminated from his firm when his unreported losses and ethical lapses came to light. He's working as a loan officer at a regional bank now. Their children have transferred to public school. Blair tells people it's because she wants them to have a more grounded upbringing. Nobody in the country club circuit believes her. She called me once, 3 weeks ago. Is the offer still available? Her voice was flat, stripped of its arrogance. Yes, I replied. I'm not ready to apologize in front of the family yet, she whispered. I was quiet for a beat. Then I'm not ready to sign the check. The line went dead. But she had called. That was a structural beginning. 6 months after my parents' passing, I finally broke the seal on my mother's diary. I sat in the heart of the garden I had redesigned, under a canopy of New England stars. The entries were heartbreakingly mundane at first. Then I reached the last 10 pages. I love my eldest, but she chases a horizon she will never reach, the appearance of perfection. I hope she realizes that what she already has is enough. About me, she wrote, Kaylee doesn't know how much she anchored us after the accident. I thought I was taking care of her, but she was the one saving us from a loneliness I didn't know we were drowning in. Kaylee is my mirror, patient, quiet, and strong in ways nobody notices until the storm hits. If you're reading this, Kaylee, know this. You were never useless. You were the foundation. I closed the diary and looked up at the vast, cold sky. The tears came, but they weren't grief. They were release. I am Kaylee Thompson. I was told to find somewhere else to die. I found home instead. If Kaylee's story reminded you that your worth is determined by your character, not your critics, I want to hear your voice. Type "Boundaries Matter" in the comments if this resonates with your journey. Don't let anyone erase your place in the family photo. Subscribe to join our community of resilient storytellers. Thank you for witnessing my journey.